big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning. What do all of these things have to do with efficiency and leadership? Today, that's what we're talking about. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Kevin Eikenberry, but you knew that. What you don't know is who my guest is. My guest today, I'm going to tell you before I introduce him. This, with all due respect to the 150 plus guests we've had here, some amazing people, this might be the smartest guy we've had on the show. His name is Edward Tenner. He is the Distinguished Scholar of the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, and is a visiting scholar in the Rutgers University Department of History. He was a visiting lecturer at the Humanities Council at Princeton, has held research positions at the Institute for Advanced Study and the University of Pennsylvania. See what I mean? His essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and many more. He has given talks to many organizations, ranging from, get this, Microsoft to the Smithsonian to TED. He has 3 books in print, as far as I know, Our Own Devices, Why Things Bite Back, and his newest book, now in paperback, The Efficiency Paradox: What Big Data Can't Do. Edward, welcome. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
I told Edward before I hit record that, and I'll tell you now that when I got the book and spent some time in it to make a decision whether we would do it or not, I knew that this book would be a departure from our normal fare here. But I think as leaders, it's important for us all to sometimes think about bigger ideas. And while I pride us in doing things that are very practical and helping people be more successful immediately, today we're going to go a little higher. We're going to go a little broader. And I don't think I could have picked a better guy, now having read much of the book, or a better book to do that. So, Edward, with all of that, how about that for a start? No pressure or anything. So you were telling me, I often ask guests about their journey, how they sort of got where they are. And you were telling me, again, before I hit record, a little bit about sort of your philosophy of your life journey. So can you tell us a little about your journey, but a little bit about that you shared with me, because I think it's fascinating and I think worth hearing.
Well, you could summarize it by saying I went from the fast track to the scenic route. I had a successful undergraduate career. I got a lot of merit badges. I had a PhD. I was in Harvard's Society of Fellows, which is a very coveted and enviable position with wonderful dinners every week and great company. And then I hit the job market of the 1970s. And I hit it with a dissertation on an extremely specialized subject, German popular disorders in the early 1830s. That had been a really neglected area of German history, and when I finished, I knew why. So my job prospects were not terribly good. And I worked in a number of, I had a number of gigs. One of them was helping one of my teachers, William McNeill, with his book, Plagues and Peoples, with research, and that book became a bestseller. So that was a kind of apprenticeship in how to write a popular book. And I also worked with Ted Marmor, a very distinguished political scientist, on healthcare policy, and I was listed as a co-author of one of his papers on the subject on Canadian and American healthcare policy. Actually, looking back, I think it's still very much worth reading, although the ideas really were his. So that prepared me for something I had never expected, which was an opening for a science editor at Princeton University Press. And I thought, why not? I'd been interested in science. I was totally unqualified, not exactly unqualified, because I had the qualification of coming from the book world. And a science PhD is not really used to thinking in book terms. So I could help scientists in a way that a scientist couldn't. And this in turn was what helped me to turn a set of lectures by Richard Feynman into a book, QED, Richard Feynman's last science book, which has sold over 500,000 copies. Well, when you've published Feynman and you're in science publishing and there aren't more Feynman books coming along, what are you going to do? So I had to start thinking
top of the ladder there, Edward.
So I had to start thinking about what came next. And so I decided, I observed that the paper recycling bins, as we were networking at Princeton University Press, the paper recycling bins were filling faster and faster. And I wrote an essay called The Paradoxical Proliferation of Paper about what went wrong with the idea of the paperless office. And this became a kind of template for future work on the unpredictable results of technology in organizations. And it became the basis of a proposal to the Guggenheim Foundation, which was successful. And then I had a chance to be a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I was very fortunate to have a great editor and a great contract from Knopf that let me become a professional writer after that. So that in turn led to another book that you mentioned, Our Own Devices on Technology and the Body. And ultimately, with the new age of the cloud, with the new age of platform companies, right, so lucrative, that gave me the idea for a new book on what this change was really meaning and what the unintended consequences of big data and algorithms would be.
I think it's a great way actually to define the book, that it's about the unintended consequences. And I think that's awesome. You told me before we came on that you think that once you sort of, that your career has a freshness state and you get to a point that you need to move on to something else. And you've just described to us how you've done that multiple times in your career. So thanks for doing that. And it's probably something all of us can ponder a little bit and think about our own freshness date. So you've written a book that I think a lot of books tend to try to, and it actually is mentioned by one of the folks on the cover. A lot of people tend to think about the future and say it's either going to be awesome or it's going to be awful. Some think that technology is the answer, and some are really worried and wary. And so my question is, where do you come down on that question?
I really come down on the side of that it's chaotic and it's unpredictable, and there are lots of good things that we think are coming that won't necessarily come, but there are other good things that we're not anticipating that will, and the same thing is true of the bad things. So our record in predicting the future has been very, very poor. In fact, there was a historian who published a book on the future as history, a kind of scenario for the future, in the late 1980s. And it was very well reviewed. And the whole premise of it was that there would be a continued rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union well into the 21st century. That was like 2 years before the fall of the wall. So even if a very respected scholar of history looking for all of the lessons of history could get things so wrong, I don't think there's very much hope. Although I think that futurists have futurism though has a very useful function, and I've written a number of essays on futurism. I've studied futurists and interviewed futurists, and what futurists can do, I think, is to exercise people's minds in scenarios and possibilities. I was at one futures planning workshop for the Library of Congress. This was around the year 2000, and one of the questions is how Google would ever become self-supporting. And one of the participants had a scenario where the government would have to take over Google. So you can see how experts can
perhaps not, right?
Yes, or the other way around. So
yeah, that's the more people's concern now, right? The other way around.
Yeah, right.
So this book, the book, one of the many interesting things about the book to me is and it's even more interesting to me now that I'm chatting with you, because you are a historian, and yet the book really does look back and is incredibly interesting just in terms of understanding where we are by looking back, which is great. And yet you're sort of helping us look forward. Maybe you don't put yourself in that futurist category, but yet you're at least asking the questions that we ought to be asking, and that sort of thing moving forward. So it's a really interesting sort of take in that perspective. And you talk about a number of things, and then you get to the last chapter. I'm actually going to go to the end first, because you make, well, actually, I'm going to do something else first, because in the preface, you wrote a paragraph that is actually your conclusion. So how about I start? Can I start there? My conclusion is that we don't have to choose between big data, algorithms, and inefficiency on one side, and intuition, skill, and experience on the other. We need the right blend. And so you end the book with a chapter that talks about the strategies and for doing that. And I want to just have you talk about a couple of those, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
we all sort of know at some level in the world about the fact that there is all of this stuff going around us, the cloud and the platforms and and the internets and all that stuff, right? All of that. And yet, and AI and driverless cars and all that stuff. And yet, how do we deal with that? And in the last chapter, you talk about 6 strategies. I want to talk about a couple. The first one, I think you point to in that opening statement, is the idea of the perfect 5. Talk to us about the strategy or the idea of the perfect 5.
Well, the perfect 5 is the idea of a distinguished roboticist at MIT who sees the real issue as not choosing between automation and human judgment, but using the complementary virtues of each to reach better decisions. And I think that's extremely important. And I was very glad that it came from Professor Mendel, who is really a wonderful historian as well as an engineer. And the point of it really is that if we rely entirely on the algorithm, sooner or later, the algorithm is going to slip up. If it's 99.99% accurate and the number is large enough, we've seen with the 737 MAX, then there's going to be tragedy. So we can't assume that just because something is very, very accurate, that we can be casual about it. On the other hand, we know from many psychological studies that we have biases, and the use of big data and the use of algorithms is a very good check on those biases. So I see that really as as checks and balances of complementary powers.
Right. And so he talks about 5 being between 0 and 10, and the middle is 5. And how do we balance that?
Yeah.
And again, I wanted to go there because that's sort of where you started in the book, and then you got us there at the end as well. And so another one of the strategies that you talked about, and it's probably Kevin's bias showing through as to why I want you to talk about this one, and that is you called it analog serendipity. Talk about that.
Yes. What I found is that very often what you happen to run into by chance breaks through the log jams in your thinking. That if you rely on algorithms to keep suggesting what you've already been doing, or to recommend the kind of people who have already been successful, you're missing an opportunity to get something that's really different, to get something that's off the charts. And one of my favorite examples is when I was driving through Illinois long ago, and I was going to be touring sites on the east shore of the Mississippi, and the highway wasn't, and still isn't, according to the latest maps, that well marked. So I came to an approach to the Mississippi, and there was a toll bridge over the Mississippi. And I said, hey, wait a minute, but the toll taker said I couldn't turn back. And so I crossed the Mississippi, and I discovered this little town, Muscatine, Iowa. And Muscatine is one of the most fascinating places that I've ever encountered. And I've learned more about it since. Muscatine once made at least 30% of the world's buttons. And they were made from the shellfish in the Mississippi, and shells brought from elsewhere. And Muscatine is also now a site for pilgrimage of Chinese visitors because the current president of China spent time there learning about American agriculture. So
That I didn't know. I knew the first, but I did not know the second.
You can discover many fascinating things because you get a little lost. And in fact, the University of Chicago magazine reprinted a chapter of the book called Let's Get Lost. And so if people are interested in following that up, that part of the book or an adapted chapter is available there.
Well, one of the things that I used to tell people all the time, I can still tell people, but they'll look at me like I'm crazy. If you want to broaden your thinking, go to a newsstand or a bookstore, both of which are harder to find. Go to the magazine section and just pick random magazines. Well, no one does that now because they just, look at the next thing recommended at the bottom of the web article they're already reading. And that's the algorithm
that's right.
telling you where to go next. And while I might be interested in that, it doesn't give me the serendipity that we get otherwise, whether that's the muscatine, Iowa effect, or whatever you want to call it. That's really awesome. That would have been another good name for the strategy, by the way, because that's an excellent story. So that most of those who are listening, other than fans of yours, those folks who are normally here are folks who are leaders, and they may be business owners, they may be leaders in the middle, senior executives, whatever. I guess my question to you is to synthesize from your thinking around all of this about what big data can't do. What should we as leaders be thinking about in this world of big data and the search for efficiency and those sorts of things? What message do you think we ought to be thinking about, or what ideas do you think we should be considering?
I think what's really important is that we know a lot more than we think we know. We have a reservoir of tacit knowledge. This applies to leaders, this applies to people on their staffs, and we can't always articulate it. It's very hard to build that into an artificial intelligence system. And what we really need to do is to respect that and not to try to outsource our judgment to algorithms, but to use algorithms to be the boss of the algorithms rather than the other way around.
Nice. I like that. I like that a lot. So I have another thought, and I have to tell you, I have told you already that I have not read every page of the book yet. I will. I've read a good bit of it. And one of the things that I hear a lot is this, and I want your take on this, and you may or may not have one, but I'm interested in your thought about this. So the world is changing so rapidly, all these things are going on, and one school of thought says that humans are adapting a lot, and the human being and the human condition is significantly different today than it was 20 years ago, 50 years, 100 years ago. And other people say, wait, humans are humans. We don't adapt that fast. We're not all that different than we were 2,000 years ago, or whatever time period you want to pick further back. And so there are sort of those two schools of thought about that. And I'm curious, from your perspective as a historian and as a writer and thinking about all of this rapid change stuff, where do you come down on that thought?
I'm more on the side of the continuity than of the radical change. I don't think that people are really that different. If people were really that different, then if we saw a Shakespeare play, if we picked up a Jane Austen novel, we would say, this is really weird. I mean, these people, I just don't understand them. And yet, when we look at the great works of literature, of art, of music, we react in really very similar ways to those of our ancestors. And this suggests to me that although there have been lots of superficial changes, I think deep down, we're really not different people. We're not different beings.
So I have to go on record in saying that I agree with you 100%. And that I think, and the reason that I asked that question, for everyone listening, is that I think as leaders, I think you need to think about that for yourself and to agree with Edward. And so that's why you often hear me talking about the deep principles of human behavior and how they relate to how we lead and all those sorts of things. But I think that you as a leader need to think about where you come down on that and how you use that to help you lead differently. So anything else you want to add to that? I did not know by the way, everyone, where Edward was going to come down on that. We happen to agree.
Well, I think, I'm glad we agree. And I would add, though, that this is why the humanities are such a great background for leaders. Why? It's really a terrific thing to take humanities courses in addition to whatever professional skills you're acquiring, because you as a leader really are dealing with a kind of human nature that hasn't changed that much. So you can get a depth of understanding, for example, from Shakespeare or Jane Austen or any of the great novelists and playwrights of the past. You can get a level of understanding that is not directly applicable in the sense, oh yeah, I read something here or something there, but this feeds into your tacit knowledge. This feeds into your understanding of the human condition. That doesn't mean that people who are widely read in the humanities are necessarily good people or good leaders, but potentially if you're already good, it gives you a chance to be even better.
So I was listening to a college basketball game the other day, and one team was trying to get closer and closer to the other team. And the one announcer took us back to Greek mythology to help make the point of one team growing. And I just found that so fascinating because it's exactly the same phenomenon. He took us back. And then of course the other person on the broadcast took us to the itsy bitsy spider. But the point is that the value and that tacit knowledge and that connection, I think is so valuable. One of the things that those of you listening and watching may know is that I co-wrote a book called The Long Distance Leader about leading remote teams in the world in which we live, where more and more folks are not working in the same location all the time. And you talk about that some in the book, Edward. In fact, in that last chapter, you talk about one of the strategies, and again, which I agree with, which is that we need to get together more. We need to get more face-to-face, and the digital communication alone doesn't solve all of our problems. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about working remotely. Right now, we all seem to think that's the trend. And as you said, though, lots of times we're proven wrong by those trends. What are your thoughts about working remotely, the future of it, and the challenges of it?
I think remote work is, again, in that perfect five category, that there is a kind of right proportion of remote and in-person work. And probably more work can be done by people at home, but they also have to be together for a certain time, because there are all kinds of subtle signals that are transmitted in person that you don't get. There's a bandwidth there that you really don't get even with a web meeting or web connection, great as they are. There are all kinds of things that happen that way, things that people notice. And I've attended quite a few meetings. I'm on a corporate board, and it's very important for people actually to be there in the room. And there are also chances for a kind of serendipity, that conversations that you might have over coffee might be more important than what's actually discussed on the agenda.
Well, and you know, we all know that. I mean, I think we are in agreement. I really appreciate the insight, because you know, in the old days, which is probably in the 70s or 80s, there was a commercial that said the next best thing to being there, and they were talking about the phone, right? I would actually say that the way you and I are communicating right now is the next best thing to being there, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. No,
it's not the same. And it is. I mean, I tell people all the time, turn off your email and turn on your webcam, but it's still not the same as being in the same room. It's why I've got someone on my team flying here next week to spend a couple of days and spend time working on some things physically here rather than at a distance. Again, I'm asking the historian now to be the futurist. And even though you've already sort of told us that we're not very good at that, here's the question that I wrote, and I'm just going to read it the way I wrote it. What is something everyone thinks is a for sure about what's coming that you're not so sure about?
The biggest one in that category is the completely autonomous self-driving car, and I discuss that in the book. And the more I see, the more I'm convinced, first of all, that there will be pervasive features of cars that are more autonomous. For example, I would be very surprised if we didn't have better ways of driving long distances on interstate highways. that would, already adaptive cruise control is a tremendous thing. And I say this as the owner of an older car that just has standard cruise control, and I have to disconnect it because it always is about to take me into the rear of the car ahead of me. So I think there's a great room for algorithms to improve that kind of driving. On the other hand, one of the things that we've seen in the 737 MAX case is that if skills are allowed to atrophy, especially driving skills, then when in 1/100th of the percent that the systems don't work, we will not be prepared to step in. So I would say that that complete autonomy is probably the one that I doubt the most.
Well, and you talk a good bit in the book about this idea that, if we rely on the algorithm, if we rely on the technology, that our own skills atrophy. And I remember conversations about that in the 1970s when I got my TI-30 calculator, right? Oh, no one's going to be able to do math. No one's going to be able to add, subtract. And, there's some truth to that. You watch people in a situation and they can't hardly do it with that. Of course, they don't have a calculator now. They have a calculator on their phone. But so I think that not meaning to be a Luddite, but I think that's back to this balance, this blend you talk about right from the beginning of the book, this idea of we got to find the right balance. And if we lean too far either way, we may not find the benefits that come from the technology, or we may lose the benefits that come from what makes us human beings, right?
Well, by the way, going to the calculator example, I would say that
it just shows that I'm old, Edward, right?
No, I am. I went through that myself. But here's the thing about the calculator example. What the calculator really suggests to me is that we need a different set of mental skills. We don't really need the set of being a human abacus, which is actually a competitive sport in some Asian countries. The ability, somebody who is experienced in using an abacus doesn't need a physical abacus anymore. They can just do it all in their heads, and that's wonderful. But there are other skills of knowledge of orders of magnitude. There are other skills that we can use in checking the results of the calculator. So that suggests a difference in how calculation is taught, that it's really should be taught more as a matter of those skills that we need to check on what the calculator is doing.
Yeah. And I'm sure everyone who's watching and listening is thinking of 5 other examples. I've got 5 other examples in my own head right now, and we won't go there. So before we close, Edward, I guess I have 4 more things for you, and they'll get easier as we go. How about that? But I think the last big question I have for you is there anything else? You know who our audience is. Is there anything else maybe that we didn't talk about? Or is there something else that you think you'd like to share that you think that as leaders you'd like us to know or consider that we haven't talked about?
Well, one issue that has concerned me is the use of algorithms in screening job applicants. And I can recognize how faced with a torrent of applications that are made so much easier now by all of the technology, that you need some way to identify the best candidates. What I saw in publishing, though, was that the backgrounds of successful editors were really very, very different. But I saw something else, and that is that the environment in any business or industry can change a lot in a few years. So if you optimize an organization for the people who have been successful recently, and you use the algorithm to identify them, then you have a potentially dangerous kind of monoculture. You have people who are very, very good at doing things in one way, but it could turn out, partly because of changing technology, that you need another set of skills. And I saw that in publishing. There were some people who were really very, very familiar with the technical side. There were other people who were really very good at editing and making things more understandable. And so I think that you really need, just as investors need a diversified portfolio, organizations also need a diversified portfolio of personalities. I mean, think of the US Navy. Hyman Rickover the father of the atomic submarine, did not fit the pattern of successful naval officers. Neither did Grace Hopper. So the people like that are really essential in organizations, and that to me is one of the big takeaways.
Awesome. So when you're not writing books, challenging us to think differently, which you're certainly doing with this book for me, what do you do, Edward, for fun? When you're not driving your car into the back of somebody else, like what do you do for fun?
Well, one of the things I do for fun is collect too many books, and I like to exercise my peripheral vision. That is one of the correlates of my book, that you can see things in your peripheral vision because of the physiology of the eye that you couldn't looking at things directly. This is used by some astronomers too, that they can see objects. You can see things, for example, that are moving in the background when you're not looking directly at them. It's a very interesting effect. And so we had, by the way, I have to wave my arms now because I'm in a room with
You're in a room. I wondered what happened.
Automatic light.
Moved enough.
So I'm just proving, just let there be light. It's a godlike power that we get.
So it's the algorithm, right?
Yes,
algorithm.
Yes.
You can't tell that you're really there.
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoy is going to book sales, because there's always a surprise there. There's always something that I didn't even know existed, and this is partly business, but partly recreation for me. Just discovering some weird novelist, discovering some obscure line of thought that maybe eventually I can turn into something for publication, but maybe just for fun. And I found the other day at a local book sale a book I'd always been looking for. It was by a sociologist named Keith Hopkins, and it's called Death and Renewal. And Death and Renewal is a study of the ancient Roman aristocracy and mobility in ancient Rome. And the point of Death and Renewal is that there were many more additions to the Roman senatorial class, the upper class, than people realized. There was a lot more mobility. And why? It was because ancient Rome was such an unhealthy place, even for the rich, that they died young. And so there was a real turnover of elites. And it occurred to me that one of the quote unquote problems of society is that we are all living so much longer. And positions that otherwise might have been vacated early now may be occupied by people well into their 70s or even 80s. There's a famous building in Princeton, Blair Tower, at the entrance to the campus. And while I was passing it, one day I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, maybe because I was older, and that is that both of the architects had died in their late 30s or early 40s. And this was what opened up the position of head architect of Princeton to the Bostonian Ralph Adams Cram, who ultimately designed many of the iconic buildings of the Princeton campus. In other words, this was this big opportunity that the two biggest architects of Philadelphia had died young. And then Princeton was looking for a new supervising architect. So when I think of architects today, and I've actually written a piece about this, what's amazing is how late 20th and early 21st century architects continue to produce until their 80s or even 90s. So that makes it much, much harder for younger architects.
For a new guy.
So I'm not sure what the implications are for leadership, but maybe living is the best revenge, and you should appreciate it.
Exactly. So here's a little inside baseball for everybody. The only question that I ask for each episode that I tell people, the only question that I ask that I tell people ahead of time is that question about what are they reading now. And I got feedback a long time ago, and I told Edward, and that led him to tell us about that book. So that's his answer to that question. That's the book he's going to be reading, is Death and Renewal by Keith Hopkins. So I have one last question for you, Edward, and that is, where can we learn more about you and your work and this book? Tell us where we can go.
I have a website, edwardtenner.com, and there are links. I am sorry that because Dropbox mysteriously decided to abolish their public links, that I have been laboring to create new links in Google. So Dropbox people out there, I am disappointed in you, but there's quite a bit there that's there. For example, you can read about the social construction of the German Shepherd dog. You can read about the history of the top hat. I have lots of these little interests, and I'm always delighted to share them.
Listen, where else, everybody, are you going to get to learn about the history of the top hat? But right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So I have one question for all of you who are listening, and that is the question I ask you every episode, and that is, now what? Now, I know that I started by saying, well, this is going to be a different episode, perhaps. And yet, if you scan back through what you've just heard, there are plenty of application ideas for you, plenty of things for you to think about, as well as, of course, you're getting a copy and reading a copy of The Efficiency Paradox, What Big Data Can't Do. But beyond that, the challenge for you is, what can you take from this and what will you do something with, or what will you think about differently, or what will you apply from what you've taken from our time? Because if you don't do that, at some level, it won't have been nearly as valuable as it could have been. So, Edward, thank you so much for having been here. It was a real pleasure. We had a little challenge getting started, but I'm so glad that we got together, and I'm so glad that you spent the time with us today.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right, everybody. So before I go, last thing, if you'd like to join in this conversation, get updates, have a hand in how this podcast evolves, and even suggest people that you'd like to have me have a conversation with, you can do that by joining our podcast Facebook group. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. That's how you can do that. And we're here every week. So come back and join us again, won't you, on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.